Hi, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. So I'm Tom Donahoe, and I don't know if you could see them, but Alonzo, why don't you go ahead and stand up? That's Alonzo, who'll be presenting after me, and that's Ayako from the law school. And if you could stand back up, Ayako, if we could give her a round of applause for shepherding the anti-criminalization bill through the state legislature. Okay, so we might be doing that twice. And Dr. Mills stepped out, or is he in the room? It's his birthday, so a round of applause for Dr. Mills. Okay, so all of you should have a clicker, and so Alonzo and I have committed to speaking quickly because we're sure that we want to allow lots of time for Ayako's session, and especially for questions for her, because I know lots of you probably have more questions for the attorney than for us. And so we just did introductions, and sorry, this is a little bit sensitive. So let me ask really quickly in the room, how many years have you been working in HIV? We'll test the clickers out. So you probably can't see it, but I can see how many people have voted. So we're up to 43, 44, 46, 47, 50. Can we get to 50? Come on, there we go. Okay, so we'll call 50 sort of a quorum for the group. Wow, so you can see we probably need to put 30 plus for Jerry Gates and me and a few other people who've been doing this for a really long time. But you can see we have hundreds of years of HIV experience in the room. And so that's why we're looking forward to your questions because we've got lots of experience and it's important for the new people to hear about it. This is a slide that I said I would take 30 seconds to explain, but when you've been teaching about HIV for 27 years, as I have, and my mentor at the UCLA School of Medicine, Dr. Charles Lewis, taught me about the importance of teaching in the affective domain. And that's the affective domain in HIV is often the domain that's the most important to consider when you're teaching about something. And so over the 27 years, I've taught the first 5 years were largely about death and dying, and all of the affective issues or how you feel about that go into it. Sexual history taking with the medical students, we can give them the 60-second sexual history. They're UCLA medical students, they'll get it 100% correct. We can videotape them, we know they have the skills, but when they get out into the community, how they feel about asking their patients that questions will actually potentially stop them from doing it. And so I'm just gonna ask you today to think about how you feel about immigration. Immigration is an issue that evokes a lot of feelings, and so just to be aware of how you feel about it. And we know that immigration can affect the care continuum. So we think about lots of different patient populations, but I think we need to increasingly think about how immigration can impact the care continuum. And I'll ask you to share your quick opinion on that. So if we think of, this is the national AETC continuum that we use nationally. And so I'm gonna add a group of people, and that's all the people that are out there that are at risk for HIV. So I'll call that group 1. Group 2 are the people that don't know their HIV antibody status yet. Group 3 are all the people who've been diagnosed. Group 4 are the people who've been linked to care, and Group 5 are the people that are in care that we're trying to improve their services and maintain an undetectable viral load. Which group do you think is most impacted that have immigration concerns? So where are they most impacted? So think about people who have immigration concerns. Where does it most impact the continuum? So go ahead and vote. You can't say all of them. Does that make sense to people? So where do you think they're most impacted? Is it the people who don't know their HIV antibody status, the people who've just been linked, the people who just are already in care and maybe have an undetectable viral load, or is it the people who are at risk? Who do you think's most impacted because of their concerns over their immigration status? Oh, sorry, that's the voting. I depend on when to let me know when I'm messing up. So we got 25 votes. People are thinking about this one a little bit more. Can I get 5 more votes, bring us to 50? Okay, I'll go ahead and close it at 45. Wow, why are all US elections like this recently? It's like Everything's closer tied. So, I mean, I think that points out that this can really impact someone at any stage of the continuum. So it can prevent someone from getting PrEP services. It can prevent someone from getting tested. And I think that kind of is intuitive to people, but if you read the LA Times day before yesterday, you could see that there was a story about this very issue. Wasn't directly related to HIV, but when you look at domestic violence reports among Latinos, you can see in our state, in San Francisco, San Diego, and Los Angeles, they were all down dramatically, and they were barely down in non-Latinos. And so a lot of that has to do with people with immigration concerns. Just driving in this morning, I don't know if people were listening to NPR, but there was a report on NPR about a pregnant woman who was refusing to leave her house because of her fear that if she went to an evacuation center in Northern California from the fires, there could be immigration and customs enforcement there. And so this has been discussed. It's not yet in the literature. It's not yet in peer-reviewed literature, but hopefully it will be, about what are the real impacts of these concerns. There's been a couple reports about it in the Huffington report. This one was before the election, and they just updated it to after the election. So it's hard to read the top there, but over the past 2 years, I've worked with blank number of HIV-positive patients who had shared with me their immigration concerns. And when I say, I know immigration concerns is, it sounds broad, but it doesn't just have to be someone's own status. It could be a family member in their house, and they're afraid to access services because there's a family member in the house that has immigration concerns. So how many patients have you had that have shared, oh, sorry, it looks like, there, polling is open. So if you vote again, so we have 30. We losing voters? Okay, we'll stop that at 40. Okay, so 38% of the room have already had 5 HIV positive patients share their immigration concerns. So we know this is a huge issue for LA County. And what are we, about 67% have had at least one patient share immigration concerns with them. So probably our number of HIV positive patients who have immigration concerns is larger than the HIV population of many cities in the United States, just because we have such a huge population in the county. So this says, I believe our HIV clinic, our program, is perceived to be a safe place for patients with immigration concerns. So how confident are you that your program or your clinic, people feel really secure going to? They're not worried about going to it. And this could be an evolving thing. You might have thought it was one thing, a few months ago, and now you're questioning it. And that's why one of the reasons we have an expert lawyer to talk about how you can help communicate that. So half the room is 100% sure, and I think that's great. And I think many of you may be participating in the California Community Foundation monthly meeting about immigration concerns and what you can do to help ensure that your clinic is a safer place. But still, 22% are sort of in the iffy range, and 27% are not sure, are just saying no, it isn't. And so there are flyers that I think, do we have one in their handouts? Yeah, we have the Spanish version in your handout, but you can get them in English and Spanish. And certainly if you go to this monthly meeting at the California Community Foundation, you can get resources like this that help explain to people their rights around accessing healthcare in California. And I'm going to close by saying, probably some of you are used to hearing me present about our work with Mexico and our work with keeping binational patients in HIV care. It's something that actually last year, Sandra and I went to the border. We do a lot of work on the border, and we train ICE clinicians about keeping HIV patients in care. The woman in red to the far left is our champion infectious disease physician within ICE who helps us. We've got some good people there who want to do good clinical work. And last year, in October, we were doing a presentation kind of gearing up for, after the election, having immigration reform. And so our work was really looking at what are we going to do to keep HIV patients in care who have new status and can travel to Central America and Mexico for the first time. Obviously, that changed. And so our work now largely focuses on how do we make sure that clinics are safe spaces so people still feel comfortable to stay in care. and also that they know that if they do return to Central America or Mexico, they can access HIV care. And so that's a longer discussion, and I'd be really happy to come to your sites to talk about that presentation, which is about an hour. So that's my part right now, and I'm going to turn it over to Alonzo, who's going to talk about the mental health impact and resiliency skills that you can work with patients who have immigration concerns. And we're going to save questions for all three of us at the end.
Good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to say it's an honor to come speak to the commission. It's always an honor to speak to folks who are doing the work and who can impact and affect change both on a micro and a macro level. And so I was just asked to come speak today regarding the social, emotional, and psychological well-being of folks who have immigration concerns or of our undocumented communities. So I've been, as Ricky had mentioned, I've been working in the field of HIV services for approximately 20 years, and primarily in Latino LGBTQ communities. And so there are certain, and I think folks who have worked with different Latino communities have also noticed certain psychosocial stressors that Latinos living with HIV have experienced. Ooh, it is sensitive. Okay. So the psychosocial stressors in the colored boxes are probably not new to anybody sitting in this room. Folks living with HIV and who are Latino and who have immigrated to this country experience HIV stigma of mental health service, of accessing mental health services, heteronormativity, racism, socioeconomic status, sexism, transphobia. But one of the psychosocial stressors that I've noticed an exacerbation in recently, since the beginning of the year, has been an anti-immigrant climate, which many of our patients are experiencing personally. So the folks who I've worked with, who have been undocumented for the last 20 years, have shared basic themes around feeling invisible, feeling of wanting to recede into the background, not wanting to call attention to themselves. So this sense of hypervigilance, this sense which then can create this sense of isolation and invisibility. But this piece, this anti-immigrant climate piece, is relatively new, or not new, it's exacerbated. I think there's always been an anti-immigrant climate in the United States, but it's changed its focus. And so the undocumented, what I've noticed, are experiencing an existential crisis. And this is not only for folks who are living with HIV or for folks who are undocumented. This applies across most Latino communities that I've interacted with. I've interacted with families, children, 6-year-olds, who are documented, parents are documented, but are in fear that their friends or their tia or their tío or their aunt or uncle will be deported. So this is an actual crisis, an existential crisis that many Latinos are experiencing currently. And so you add that layer on top of the others. So oppressive forces that Latinos are experiencing and people living with HIV are experiencing, it creates this this feeling of powerlessness. So I want to ask folks, it's a yes/no question, or don't know, or non-applicable. I have worked with patients, clients living with HIV whose mental health has recently been negatively impacted by immigration concerns. All right. So a large percentage of you have worked with folks whose mental health has negatively been impacted by immigration concerns. That's important to understand. And also important to understand how it is that we can work with folks who are coming in with different psychosocial stressors related to immigration and HIV. The one piece I did want to also impress upon folks is there is a certain level of transgenerational trauma that many Latinos experience. So we're talking, what I'm referring to is the effects of colonialism and colonialism of the mind. Remember, countries like Mexico were colonies longer than the United States has been a country. So this sense of otherness, this sense of of not wanting to express their indigenous culture is something that many folks have experienced and is part of the trauma that we carry from generation to generation. So it's important to understand this as well, because this is the larger context in which we're living. So what are some things that we can do when we're working with folks who are coming in with these different psychosocial stressors? So we really want to build on the resiliencies that people come in with. So our community members who are undocumented are extremely resourceful, have a skill set that I'm not sure I have. And so if we can frame it and mirror back to them their resiliencies, it can help them gain a sense of self, a different sense of self. Because oftentimes when people are out there living and surviving, I don't think they necessarily understand what skills they actually do have and are utilizing in day-to-day interactions. And we also have, as Latinos are not a monolithic group. But there are some pieces that kind of weave throughout most Latino communities. And one of them is this sense of social support as being a protective and ameliorative factor. Latinos, in general terms, tend to be familially identified and communally identified. And if we can tap into that and kind of support that within them, within the communities and working with them, we can then create this sense of safety. So it's really moving from an external locus of control to an internal locus of control. And that is how we can build on self-resiliency and inner resiliencies. There is a concept referred to as crisis competence. Crisis competence merely posits that folks who have experienced crises in the past have a certain skill set that they can move to and apply to different crises that as they're happening in the moment. So in essence, folks who've experienced crises in their countries of origin or in this country as well can utilize that same skill set in addressing the current stressor. And it really does create this protective factor. And if we can learn to mirror back to our patients the strength and resiliencies that they have from within, it does give them a different sense of self. And of course, adding to that, adaptive coping skills. Our patients or clients are constantly coping with stressors. Sometimes it's maladaptive, including substance use. But if we can kind of show them that they have these adaptive, or teach them adaptive coping skills, or just kind of maybe pivot their coping skills to something that is more healthful and beneficial to them, we can actually help them change their perspective. And so, of course, for folks who are struggling with SUD, getting them into SUD treatment, getting folks into mental health treatment, altruism, the sense of altruism is incredibly impactful. So for folks who've been living with HIV for many years, one of the things that I've noticed are folks who have been able to give back to the community, folks who are participate in social support groups, are the folks that tend to manage the disease and manage their psychosocial stressors in a much different way, because there's a different meaning to their life. They've been able to change something from a sense of adversity to a sense of strength. And that is incredibly impactful for folks in managing stressors. So building internal self-resiliency is really nothing other than, like I stated earlier, moving from a sense of an external locus of control to an internal locus of control. So it's really building on the client's belief that they can cope with the stressor at hand, allowing them this sense of self-worth, accessing the client's inner dialogue, kind of really evaluating how the patient is presenting what they're saying, and maybe providing an alternative narrative for them, an alternative narrative based on their resiliencies, on their strength, on the strength of the community. And then also assess the client's perceived sphere of influence regarding the societal messages. And this is really activism. Folks who are able to, and we see this with the dreamers. We see this with certain sections of folks who are undocumented, who have been able to take their undocumented status and use it as a form of activism within their life to affect social change. That is incredibly impactful and incredibly meaningful for folks. And if we can provide them that sense of self, and really allow them a different internal and external social landscape, we can really allow folks the ability to thrive, not just survive, which many folks do, but actually thrive. So what we ask, or what we try to do at Ultimate with our patients is create an environment of safety. And I have to say, there are some of our patients who have been accessing our care at our clinic for 15 years and who have accessed mental health for many years, and who, at the beginning of this year, were starting to come back to mental health because of increased anxiety, increased depressive symptoms. And so what that tells me is that they feel safe not only in our clinic, but also understanding the value of mental health and mental health services. So an installation of hope is something that we can provide our patients so that we can provide them that internal sense of strength, that internal sense of safety, which is very important as folks navigate this world, navigate the complexities of this new experience that we are all kind of part of now. And sometimes it's not about instilling hope. Sometimes it's just about managing the current stressor. It's providing folks with cognitive behavioral therapy that allows them to address the anxiety, manage the depressive symptoms, and then just kind of sit with it because it doesn't feel good. And sometimes we're not going to feel good, and just allowing patients that opportunity to just feel their feelings and understand that they're going to be safe. And if they're coming back to your clinic, that tells me that they feel safe at your clinic. And sometimes your clinic or your place of employment is the only place that person feels safe. So we really have to understand that, and it helps us to understand that and then build on that as well. So providing support groups, building upon the patient's or client's mastery and agency. Forums and educational materials, which is what we're doing today. And I really want to highlight the red cards. If folks are not familiar with them, I'm sure most folks are. There are these little handheld cards that on one side, here you go. You could actually hand these out to patients. On one side, it has information in Spanish as to what their rights are, what they should say, what they should not say. And on the other side is in English that they can hand to an ICE agent and let them know what they're not agreeing to, basically. So when we are able to provide our patients with something tangible or information, the information you're going to glean from Ayako today, this is vital information in allowing patients to feel this sense of safety and build on their sense of resiliency and build on their internal experience of strength. Like I mentioned before, our patients are incredibly resilient. They've really managed a number of different stressors, leaving their country of origin, learning a new language, living in a culture that is foreign to them. These are all things that people take for granted, but really speak to the person's sense, their internal strength. And if we could, again, mirror that back to them, which they might not see as a strength, it is deeply meaningful for them. And finally, I really want us to understand this sense of cultural humility, that it's important to understand that even though we are professionals and experts in our respective fields, our patients are experts in their lives. And so when we work with our patients, it really should be about co-constructing an experience with them. It really is about understanding our own power and privilege and understanding that oftentimes, unless we have that in check, we can be colluding with all those different psychosocial stressors that I mentioned earlier. So it's very important that we understand our role as providers and helping professionals and really view the patient as being capable and responsible and respectful. Because again, they are the masters of their life. We can mirror back to them their strength, but they are the folks who are living the life that they're living, and we have to honor that. And I think that's it. So I'm going to turn it over to Ayako.
Good morning, everyone. I wake up every day and I feel like it's a mixed bag. severe understatement, but still very important. The bill that Tom alluded to was a huge success for us, changing the laws that criminalize people living with HIV in California. It's a huge success. So it didn't happen just by one person, just by two people. It was everybody. And I just want to honor that, because if we don't honor the good things, I think we're going to get a little lost. So I want to go over some constitutional rights today, talk about how they can be deployed in interactions with immigration enforcement bodies. I want to talk about what are some things that we need to understand, whether we're providers or clinicians, about how to create this safe space. I'm glad to hear so many of you feel that your space is safe. I want to talk about the difference between law and policy. This is a very important distinction. I want to make sure that you all walk away with an understanding about that. And I want to talk about your role as providers. So as a lawyer, I always have a disclaimer. Please do not take this information and either decide that I'm an expert. I know some things. Please do not rely on this information to provide advice. That would be the unauthorized practice of law. And I would recommend that you do not do that. But I think that this is important information for you to understand, to better understand what's going on globally and nationally and locally in your neighborhoods. So how frequently do you serve immigrants? All right. So this is not something I'm surprised by. I don't know if all of you understand the fact that Los Angeles County is almost half Hispanic, identified as Hispanic. I don't know if you know that it's the second largest county with a Hispanic population, second only to New York, and that the epidemic impacts on the Latino community, mostly of Mexican origin, that we know here in Los Angeles County. 42% of people living with HIV identify as Hispanic. I prefer Latinx, just so you know, but sometimes the distinction is in the way the data is collected, so I'll use Hispanic where it applies. Do you serve undocumented individuals? Now, in a recent conference, we had to steer away from the conversation of undocumented individuals, and we had to use the term categorically ineligible. And that's in part because of the environment that we're in currently. Now, I don't know how far this video is going to be circulated, so I don't know that I want to say too much, other than that we all know in this room who we serve. Oop. Oof. Okay. 89%. Similar question to what was asked before. In the past several months, have any of your immigrant clients or patients living with HIV expressed concerns with regard to their immigration status? The reason why I'm asking these questions is I'm actually surveying you. I really should have asked for consent, but it's anonymous. Five more. Okay. That's okay, everyone's getting coffee. I understand. All right. It's a lot of frequentlies. Okay. Did I get it right, Tom? There we go. Has your agency in the past several months specifically discussed immigration policies and impacts on the client population? Yes. But only half about. It's interesting. Has your agency taken steps to address this issue? This is so touchy. Too many questions I'm asking, so I apologize. All right. So 58%. And do you need more resources to address these issues? All right. 8% said no. I want to know who that is. Please come talk to me. All right. Okay. So, who are the folks that are at risk of removal? Removal is the term we use technically for deportation. And so, when we think about this topic, we think about certain subsets of folks and who are vulnerable. And in this case, we have three sort of categories of folks. We have folks that came in lawfully under a visa and then violated the term of that visa by overstaying their visa. So think student visa, right? Tourist visa. It's a very common way of coming into the country. The second category of folks are non-citizens with criminal convictions. So it might be a mixed set of statuses, but folks that are essentially not a citizen, so anything that kind of falls below that threshold, that might have been caught up with the criminal justice system. It includes felonies, some misdemeanors, and other violations. And then the last one is undocumented folks, folks that really have entered without inspection, have really been living under the radar, some for very, very long periods of time. And so one of the areas I think that we sort of look to for guidance is this document called the Constitution. It's a living, breathing document. And the reason why I say that is because what we have is case law, right? Every time there is a lawsuit that goes up, and by goes up, I'll say, usually it goes to a district court, then a federal court, then the Supreme Court. But a lot of cases, they get stuck in the circuit court, which is before the Supreme Court. So here we live in the Ninth Circuit. Oh, by the way, this is Law 101. I'm not a great law professor yet, so if I get any part of this wrong, my students can tell you. They're better educated. So the Ninth Circuit has made a couple of decisions that make them unique. And so there are times when we'll make statements where we have to still go back and double check because the law is always changing and shifting, right? The interpretation of the laws can be different according to what circuit. And it's really the Supreme Court's job to come in only and when there's a circuit split, meaning that there are different regions that have decided, different circuits of the federal court system that have decided differently on what the law is. So one of the things that's come to light for us is the minute we found out about the election results, I also run a legal services collaborative where we have a centralized intake line. We saw an uptick in calls from people who were very, very, very scared. And it included, again, that mix of folks, right? Folks with different types of status, folks with past criminal convictions, folks with no status. And what we figured out is that really, the number one thing people wanted to know was, am I safe? So regardless of status, what we realized was that we needed to sort of be able to answer that question to some degree. And the reason why we do it in a trio is in large part because Alonzo is the person that makes me feel better. And the reason why is because the law doesn't. I'll explain in a little bit. So here, what we rely on from the U.S. Constitution is the Fourth Amendment. It's the amendment that prohibits unreasonable search and seizure. Search and seizure includes your body, you, and your stuff. And so here we have different rules for different places. I don't know if you knew that. And so here, every area that you see listed has to be evaluated for what is considered a reasonable expectation of privacy. And in the case of health settings, what we generally go with in terms of the rule is that patient examination rooms are areas in which people should have a reasonable expectation of privacy. That rule isn't subjective. It's not whether you feel that way, but it's supposedly objective if we have this rational man that's incorporated into our law. And the question is would someone that is a rational man, that rational man, does he believe that he's safe in the patient examination room from unreasonable search and seizure? Should that person have a reasonable expectation of privacy? For the most part, the answer is yes. So that's one thing that you can think to yourselves, well, we know that our patients are safe when they're in an examination room. But even if you feel that your clinic is safe, and even if you think you've done the best to make your clinic safe, or a safe space, I should say, it doesn't mean that the patient's pathway from home to the clinic is safe. So you have to think, what are the rules in place that can either help or guide us in advising our clients? So I didn't advance it, but it went already. Here's some things that we tell people. Because we're within 100 miles of the borderland, meaning the coast or any border with another country, the Constitution doesn't apply in the same way it would in other places. It's a little unfair. It's a lot unfair. In that space, we have Customs and Border Protection, CBP, operating in addition to ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. What that means is that at any moment in time, if you are stopped, all that immigration enforcement bodies need to have is a reasonable suspicion that you are here unlawfully. A reasonable suspicion, how do you define that? It's basically a little bit more than a hunch. So, what do we advise folks? We advise folks that these are the documents they always carry with them. Valid green card, copy of your work permit, your California driver's license or ID, and then proof of physical presence in the US for the past 2 years. That's just a weird little rule that exists because if you've been here for 2 years, you're just entitled to a smidgen more process if you are going to be deported or removed. What do we tell people not to carry? This is really important. Please do not carry fake documents. Don't carry your birth certificate. Why? It's proof of where you were born. Do not carry your consular ID. Why? It's proof of your nationality, including your passport. So these are things that we always tell people not to carry. The things that end up in the gray area are the AB60 driver's licenses. So some of you are shaking your heads. A lot of folks have gotten those driver's licenses. Why? Because they could get in trouble if they don't carry them. But they also very clearly state that you don't have sufficient immigration status to be present. For the purposes of immigration law, you may be unlawfully here, and so it's a big clue. So what we tell folks now is carry it when you're driving so you're in compliance with the law. When you're not driving, don't carry it. Am I increasing your anxiety a little? Deep breathing. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I honestly don't know if I'm a really good human right now. I feel like I'm not operating very well. But it's in large part because I identify with this issue so much on a personal level. And even though I have reached certain spaces and been in certain circles where I feel very, very lucky and very, very fortunate, this climate has hit me. It has hit me really hard. And I'm a child of immigrants, and it's very personal. And I think in a way that if folks don't identify with that, I think that the crisis with North Korea should. That feeling of being unsafe it's something that doesn't leave you. My late father-in-law used to tell a story. He lived in Gardena right before my partner was born, and he used to cut a circle in the curtain. Is this story familiar to anyone? A circle in the curtain to peer through. He's jumped out of windows before, right? So there was a time in which these things were happening before, and a lot of folks who survived it say, well, we'll survive this one too, but it doesn't mean that it's not hard. So what do we look to when it comes to protections? So immigration law. Oh. Constitutional law, the Fourth Amendment that I just spoke of. We've long relied on the use of discretion, and that's discretion by the federal government. Some of you may not know that Obama's nickname was Deporter-in-Chief. Actually, Obama deported a lot of people. But one of the things that his administration did was they still used discretion. And discretion is an action essentially where the government would take mercy on a situation where even though the law said that they could deport someone, they could remove someone, they chose not to. So folks in the community have cases where it was administratively closed. It means the Department of Justice stopped pursuing. Withholding of removal, these are terms you've probably heard. Convention against torture, those are situations where they could find that those protections should apply to the person. And I would say that it was, in some cases, an act of mercy. There's law, then there's guidance. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's collateral consequences. So one of the things that we found out, for example, in the criminalization context is that folks that were picked up on the felony solicitation charge that existed on the books, it still exists on the books until January 1st, is that would lead to then removal proceedings. So there are also collateral consequences of other processes that impact immigration. How many of you have heard of the sensitive locations policy? Oh, okay. Well, then you won't feel so sad as I did. Sensitive locations policy was put into place, I believe, in 2011, and it's still, as of now, in place. And it's the notion that there are certain places in which immigration enforcement activities really shouldn't take place. And that it's not good for our communities to instill a sense of fear. And so we're going to make a policy decision about that. I talk about this policy because it is incredibly important to a lot of people. The problem is Los Angeles is within 100 miles of borderlands. So Customs and Border Protection still have broad powers. And it is questionable whether this policy really does apply in our situation. But we're going to still talk about it because we want to believe that there is some policy decisions being made still within immigration enforcement bodies. And so the idea is that at these particular sensitive locations, agents won't engage in enforcement activities without pre-approval, without some kind of exigent circumstance, or because they're there for another routine matter. Some of you might remember the news story about a father who dropped off his daughter at school, was driving away, and got picked up. Do you remember this story? Well, school is a sensitive location, except where was Dad? Driving away. He was on the street. The street is public. Your expectation of privacy when you're in public is diminished. So, what have we found with the sensitive locations policy? Again, policy, guidance. You can't go into court and enforce it. Why? Because it's discretionary. It's a policy choice made by the federal government. But if we were to rely on it, we've got hospitals, schools, places of worship, funerals, weddings, and demonstrations. So those are specific areas, right? Situations, spaces where we believe that people should feel reasonably safe. The story about the shelter, very real. When Harvey hit, CBP came out and said, we will not be engaging in enforcement activities in the shelters. Do you think everybody got that message? I'm not so sure. So the problems for healthcare settings is that guidance is not law. You cannot believe that it will protect you or protect your clients. And so you have to think through clearly in your space, in your setting, what are some ideas with regard to reasonable expectation of privacy? Are you going to be private in a waiting room? Is there a reasonable expectation of privacy in a waiting room? No. So people, when they're waiting for their appointment, they're in a space that's open for public accommodation, right? Anybody can walk in. No expectation of privacy. It doesn't matter if someone thinks that they should be safe or they should have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Again, it's not subjective, right? So that's why we rely on creating very clear zones between what is a public space and what is a private space. And some of you that have engaged in policies to try to create these delineations, such as signs in the waiting room or written policies, those are actual efforts to try to delineate that difference here. But a warrant, right, and exigent circumstances, generally speaking, are all that you need really to break that down. So generally, our recommendation to you, and there's some good resources out there to help you do this, is to develop a protocol and procedure for your clinic, for your healthcare setting, to think very clearly about your space and how you operate, to put in some stopgap measures that can serve as a speed bump to enforcement activities. Those are things that you might want to consider. And if you find that immigration enforcement bodies do violate your space in a way that you're not comfortable with and you believe that the law prohibits, file a complaint. But really the most important thing that you can do is to provide people, provide clients, provide patients with the information that they need. And here in this one moment, I'm going to give you some legal advice. Don't hide a patient. Don't fail to cooperate. And don't rely on guidance.